Welcome to part 2, picking up where we left off on the character select tutorial. This is the C++ version. In this part we'll be coding the select widget header and source files in Visual Studio. And with this one there is a lot of coding after each method, so I'll give a few seconds of silence so that you can pause the video and catch up and review the code. So if I populate a method, I'll just basically go quiet for a couple of seconds, and then if you need to pause it you can. So let's go into this part now. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to populate the header file. So we'll go into Visual Studio now, and as you can see I've got my select widget header, and under this I want to add a protected section. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call a virtual bool initialize. This comes with the API and actually has a base call as well. Semicolon. Next thing I want to do is I want to create a U function, and I want a virtual void red button pressed semicolon. And what this is, it's a method that gets used when the button is pressed on the character blueprint widget. So I'm going to highlight that, Control-C, Control-V to paste another in. And what I'm going to do next is do that again, and I want to change that to green. So I've got U function here. Wait for the IntelliSense to catch up. And last thing I want to do is I want to create an interface call method. So that's going to be void call interface, and all it's going to do is it's just going to pass in a value, the uint8 index. Control-Shift-S to save, and that's pretty much that point. So that's the protected section completed. So the next section I want is a private section, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create some bindings to the widget blueprint. So it's going to be uProperty, it's going to be meta equals capital B bind capital W widget. Underneath that I'm going to store a U button, or a pointer to a class U button. I'm going to call that real button semicolon. And as you guessed it, I'm going to just highlight that, Control-C, Control-V, change that to blue button, and again Control-V, change that to green button. And then underneath that, finally, I want to uProperty. And what I want to do is I want to have a uint8, and I want to have that as a button index. So when a particular button is pressed on the interface, it'll have a specific index related to that. Okay. And lastly, we're going to add a public section, and this is for the methods that will create this and add it to the screen, and when it needs to be removed from the viewport or closed. So the first one's going to be called is setup. Doesn't return anything. And I'm going to call this one close widget. Okay, Control-Shift and S to save. And that's pretty much our header file done. So next we'll go into the source widget. So going into the source file for select widget, we're going to populate the methods for that. So we want a bool, and what we need to do is we need to put in a U select widget, and what we need to do now is we're just going to call that initialize method here. So what we need to do next is we need to start to populate this. So next thing is, first thing we want to do is we want to call the base class. Obviously this does inherit from a superclass, so full success equals super initialize bracket semicolon. And then what we want to do is, if not success for whatever reason, open curly braces, return false. So the first thing we want to do is we need to initialize the buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an ensure check. This is something I saw in another tutorial and it's really good. So it basically asserts if there's a problem. So the first thing I want to bind to is the red button. I want to check to see if that's not null pointed. If it is, return false. And then what I want to do next is red button pointed to onClicked. Now you might recognise this from a previous tutorial that you've done, but essentially onClicked is the same thing as if you go into the character select widget and you do it in the blueprint version instead. Instead you're doing it on the C++ version. So I want to point it to this, ampersand you select widget, I want red button pressed. Okay then, it's not going to work straight away because, well, we don't have that method, so it will fail. So what we can do is if we go into a header file, we can right click on this and save having to type out quick actions and refactorings, create definition of red button pressed in source, and we can even shortcut over to it. So fingers crossed that should clear, but IntelliSense is also throwing out an error. Now the reason why is the source file needs to have the actual reference to the class. So to stop that from IntelliSense from throwing a wobbly, all we do is we look for components, / and we want the button header. Give it a couple of seconds for the IntelliSense to catch up, and it should stop that from happening. Got a bit of an old system, so IntelliSense is a little bit slow. I need to upgrade. So there you go, that stops that error. So while we're at it then, we'll, rather than trying to preempt the IntelliSense, well, we just add these other methods by going back into the header, quick actions and refactorings, create definition, close that down. We can do the same for all of these to save time. Create definition, close that, and why not? We'll do the same for call interface, create definition. So now it's time to basically create the bindings for the other buttons. So what we'll do is we're going to change, we're just going to copy that ensure. We're going to change that to blue button. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just do that again, green button. Okay, why don't we say it a little bit more time. Blue button, blue button pressed, and we'll do the same for green button as well. Green button at the start, green button pressed. Okay, so that's all of the bindings created. It's not exactly Unreal coding standards, but it makes sense. What I'll do is we'll just put these closer together. So Continuing on, what we'll do is we'll start to populate the methods, so red button, blue button, green button, and the interface calls, and the various other methods that we've created in the header as well. Continuing on, we're going to finish off this source code file. So I noticed there was a mistake I did as well in the header. I need to get rid of these brackets because that just needs to be a property. It's not a function, it's just a variable, private variable. And while I'm in the header file as well, I'm just going to do a quick actions and refactoring, and I'm just going to create the method within the .cpp source file. Wait for IntelliSense to catch up. Close that, and we'll do the same for close widget as well. Wait for that to update. Give it a second. Well, IntelliSense has been updated. There you go, it's done it, and then we're just going to basically go into the use this button to go straight into it. So each of these methods here represents when a button's pressed, but what I want to do is when a button is pressed, I want to set a particular index. So using the button index, I want the red button pressed to be number 1. Copy that into blue button. I want blue button to be number 2, and I want green button to be number 3. Why I've not started at 0 will make a lot of sense, but for now, these buttons will represent these particular index values. So going into that, what I might do as well is I might just print out a quick UE log. And what I want to do is UE log temp, comma, warning, txt, open brackets, and then what I might just say is index is percentage d to represent an integer, and I'm just going to put button index here. Close that off, and then I'm going to copy and paste it into all 3 of the methods here. Wrong side. Next thing I want to do in these is I want to call the interface in each one. So call interface, and then what I'm doing is I'm going to pass in the button index. So quickly, just Control C, Control V, Control V again. Hit that. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, I'm going to populate the call interface method. So what I want to do is I want to basically call the interface on the player controller, but the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually get the player controller. So thankfully user widget does have some methods that we can use that. So I want to get the current world pointer, and I want to get the world. Next I want to do if world is not null pointer, open parentheses, I'm going to get the player controller. So get a player controller, pointer, player controller equals world, arrow, get first player controller. Okay, so go further in if player controller is not null pointer. Then I'm going to check for the interface. So my interface is called iCharacter select interface. However, for some reason IntelliSense doesn't like it. It doesn't know what that is. So what we need to do is we need to include that. So if we just go include and then we'll just include the character select interface. Control Shift and S, and there it likes it now, it can find it. What we want to do is we want to cast to it, but what we're doing is we're casting to the iController interface, iCharacter select interface, beg your pardon, and we're passing in the player controller, semicolon. However, what I want to do is I'm going to add an additional check here when calling the interface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a board implemented just in case that the interface is on a Blueprint class and not a C++ class. So I want to call it uKismet library, system library. However, similar thing to what I had before, it doesn't know what uKismet is, so what we need to do is we need to use the gameplay statics. So includes open brackets kismet / gameplay statics .h. And as you can see, it now recognises what the Kismet system library is. So going in next, what we need to do is, well, we need to just ask, does this implement interface? And what we need to do is we need to pass in the player controller, and what we need is a static reference to uCharacter select interface, and we need to ask if that's a static class. Open brackets, semicolon, and that'll do the additional check as well. So next part, if interface is not null pointer, and it's implemented, what we want to do is we just say, well, interface arrow spawn character, and as you remember, that method takes an index, which is here, so that gets passed in here. So say if someone presses the green button, it'll call the interface with button index of 3, pass that variable in here, and it'll just pass that to the spawn character index by the interface call here. So lastly, what we need to do now is we need to set up the last two methods here, set up and close widget. Finally, we have the last two methods that we want to populate. So essentially what these two methods do is they add the widget class to the viewport, and I want the widget to look after that rather than calling that from somewhere else and doing it elsewhere. I want the widget to be responsible for it. So we'll start looking at these methods now. So if you've done Blueprints widgets, you might recognize some of the events, only you might see them in C++, but I'll go through it anyway. So for the setup, what we're going to do first, we're going to use this, which is basically a blueprint equivalent of self. I'm going to call add to viewport. Okay. Next, we want to point it to the world again. So world equals get world. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this little section from call interface, because we're actually reusing some of the code and we're getting the player controller. So copy that, paste it in there, and what we want to do is add parentheses, and that should fix IntelliSense so it doesn't throw a wobbler. So we've got the player controller, we've got the first player controller. What I want to do now is I want to basically set up an input mode. So let's do that. Go F input mode, UI only, and I'm going to call that input mode data. What I want to do is I want to input mode data. I want to set widget to focus, and I want this, and I want to do a take widget. Next, I want to lock the mouse to viewports, so input mode data dot set lock mouse to viewport behavior. And what it does is it takes in an enum, and what you want is mouse lock mode to colon and do not do not lock. Next thing I want to do is get the player controller, arrow key, set input mode, and what you do is you just pass in that input mode data, and then getting the player controller again, be show mouse cursor, and then what you do is you set it like a variable, and I want that to be true. Okay, so that's the setup done. So the next thing we need to do is, what would you want if we just want to basically close this widget? We want to remove it from viewport. Well, simply put, go this arrow, remove from viewport, and what we'll do again is we will copy this, because again we want to get the player controller. Oops, give me a second, I'll just copy that. Save a little bit of time. Put the brackets back in. So it's getting the world again. If world's not null pointer, it shouldn't be, but you never know. Get the player controller, get the first local player controller or first player controller. And what we want to do next is we want to basically set a new input mode. So input mode, we want game only, and why not, we'll just call it input mode data because it's local variable to that. And then next, I just want to get the player controller, set input mode, pass in the input mode data, and what I want to do is I want to get the player controller again, and I'm just going to say show mouse cursor equals false. Essentially what that'll do is when the widget is created, we'll call a setup method, it'll add it to the viewport, it'll get the world. If the world's not null pointer, it'll access the first player controller. If that player controller is not null pointer, it'll basically set it input data and allow you to focus the mouse onto the widget, and it'll actually show the mouse cursor as well to let you select the buttons. Next, we've got close widget, remove from viewport, does the same thing, gets the world, gets the controller, does a null pointer check on both, and it'll just set input mode game only instead. Similar to blueprints, only you're doing it in raw C++ instead. So the other thing I need to do before I head back, and I just highlight on this, is I'm just going to go quickly into this widget. I'm just going to go into the root, and I'm just going to set it to focusable. That way it doesn't spit out any errors to say that it's not focusable. So that's pretty much it. So that's the setup method, and here's the close widget method. So that brings us to the coding of the widget, and the last thing I need to do is I need to compile this to check if there's any errors. Hopefully there isn't, but you never know. Okay, so that's compiled. It took a little bit of time, but we got there in the end, and it seems to like the code in the select widget. So That brings us to a close now, so I will see you in part 3 where we'll start to code the actual player controller itself.